Our next speaker is Chris Hazzard. Chris has been an MP since 2017. He was the member of the Legislative Assembly of Northern Ireland for the Southdown constituency from April 2012. And then at that time, he was also Minister for Infrastructure in Northern Ireland until from May 2016 till the executive's collapse in January 2017. He's a passionate advocate for rural Ireland, and has been a signatory to the open letter entitled Let Cuba Live, which appeared in the New York Times, calling for an end to sanctions on Cuba. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Radhika, for your kind introduction and to the organisers for the invite to participate in this event today. It's a real privilege to share a panel with some really distinguished speakers here today and political activists here at the forefront of standing up for ordinary people against imperialist aggression, not just in Cuba, but of course throughout Latin America and indeed across the world. I suppose the fundamental question I want to address in today's discussion is, why has the US deployed aggression against Cuba? Others in this panel are much better placed to illustrate how this aggression has manifested across the last 6 decades, so I will certainly give the floor to them on that. Secondly, in reference to the title of today's event, I also want to address why I believe the US has no interest in world peace, but rather the maintenance of its hegemony as the unipolar superpower of our time. And as a result of this imperialism, many countries will continue to face persistent political meddling, cruel economic sanctions, hybrid warfare, and even outright obliteration. So why attack Cuba? Well, quite simply, the Cuban Revolution presents an alternative world vision that challenges the hegemony of neoliberal capitalist system, and there's therefore not acceptable to US imperial interests. As a result, Cuba has endured 6 decades of relentless hostility, including embargo, economic sanction, invasion, occupation of Guantanamo, the fermenting of domestic terrorism, and more than 600 assassination attempts from Fidel Castro. However, it's important to recall that Cuba's revolution was not the Kremlin-inspired communist plot often portrayed in mainstream liberal narratives. Indeed, this is evident if you examine the core message of Fidel's first declaration of Havana in 1960, where concepts such as national sovereignty, democracy, and the national self-determination of Latin American countries provided a constant thread. Even Che Guevara was still promoting the need for Cuba to build an economic management system distinct from the Soviet manual of political economy in the mid-1960s. So one of the defining characteristics then of the Cuban Revolution movement was the fact that despite the retrospective application of the communist label, it was in fact a multi-class rejection of the corrupt Batista regime, but perhaps most importantly, it was a popular uprising against the entrenched inequality, the persistent poverty and endemic racism that existed as a result of the oppressive quasi-colonial relationship with the US. As Helen, who's on this panel here today, has highlighted in her recent work, it's clear from the internal memos from the early 1960s that Cuba was keen to develop trade and investment opportunities with the rest of the world at that time, but the US intimidated and controlled a number of states around the world to ensure that they abandoned any such plan. US President John F. Kennedy then asked his brother Bobby to bring the terrors of the earth to bear on Cuba. As White House memos from both the Kennedy and Johnson era revealed that successive US administrations were deeply concerned in respect of Cuba's, and I quote, successful defiance of US policies and interests in the region dating back to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. It was feared then that Cuba's successful defiance might once again encourage other Latin American peoples suffering comparable conditions to pursue a similar path of revolution. For that reason then, successive US administrations have been wedded to the belief that it is necessary to punish the Cuban civilian population severely until they rise against their own government. And so for 6 decades, aggression has reigned. Central to this aggression has been a complex set of economic sanctions and financial embargoes that have been designed and implemented as collective punishment of the Cuban people, a war crime made possible not merely by US military power, but the imperialist construction of a global trade and finance system through US-dominated institutions in the wake of Bretton Woods in 1944. In recent decades, we've also seen the deadly consequence of such indiscriminate economic sanctions on the civilian populations in Iraq, and more recently in Iran and Venezuela, as we've just heard. In Iran, sanctions have undermined the government's ability to purchase many products, including vital medical supplies, which has huge ramifications for Iran's universal public health system. In Venezuela, Donald Trump stiffened sanctions first imposed by Obama by targeting the Venezuelan oil industry in 2017, causing a loss of $6 billion within the first 12 months alone. Crucially, this loss of hard currency consequently harmed Venezuela's ability to pay for imports. Like Iran, the impact on medicine imports was especially destructive. In 2013, Venezuela was importing approximately $2 billion in medicines. By 2018, however, that had fallen drastically to just $140 million. The inevitable result of this has been the death of many thousands of Venezuelan citizens. Indeed, as US economist Jeffrey Sachs has illustrated, there was a 31% increase in general mortality in Venezuela in the 17-18 period. That's approximately an additional 40,000 deaths. There's little doubt that these sanctions were the direct cause of many of these deaths, and that numerous high-ranking US officials should today be in jail for murder, as these sanctions are nothing short of crimes against humanity. The ongoing embargo and unilateral sanctions against these countries and their civilian populations, especially in light of COVID, is a war crime. Let's make no mistake about that. Yet, despite repeated warnings from the UN and the International Court of Justice ruling in 2020 against the US in favour of Iran, the new Joe Biden administration has shown no appetite for loosening the noose. Indeed, as was seen earlier this summer, Biden has introduced a further 4 sets of sanctions against Cuba, despite his campaign promises to repeal many of the 240 odd sanctions introduced under Donald Trump. And of course, Biden has been able to break his campaign pledges by sticking to the well-established imperialist tactic of inventing a false narrative to justify illegal actions for a domestic audience. So where it was first fighting communism, then it was the war on drugs, then we had the war on terror, now we have the new Trojan horse of humanitarianism and human rights. Alan MacLeod, in fact, published a striking article earlier this year on how corporate media in particular uses language to encourage elements within the left political spectrum to support imperialist wars and intervention. MacLeod identified 1, the plight of women, 2, attacking his own people, 3, saving democracy, and 4, human rights as the core arguments now advanced by corporate media in the service of imperialist ambitions. Indeed, Libya is a case in point, where a bombing campaign was sold by corporate media in Europe and the US as a necessary humanitarian intervention. Yet the attacks obliterated most of Libya's infrastructure and killed more than 10,000 people. What it had, of course, provoked intervention was Gaddafi's long record of defying US imperialism in Africa, particularly his success in defying US attempts to establish Africa Command headquarters on the continent in 2006. So despite the humanitarian narrative spun by the mainstream media, the primary motivation for the US and NATO to overthrow Gaddafi was the US determination to establish and maintain a military and economic hegemony over Africa. It's worth noting that the HQ for AfricaCom is still in Stuttgart in Germany, as resistance among African nations has only grown since the Libyan intervention. In Afghanistan too, despite the dominant narrative, humanitarian concerns were, according to at least one senior British intelligence official from the time, much less significant than other factors, and I quote, "The human rights side only became part of the public rationale in order for the government to get the Guardian readers of the world on board." And as for the US and their allies being involved in a war for democracy in Afghanistan, they were in fact propping up one of the most corrupt regimes in the world, whose troops and police ruthlessly robbed and pillaged their own people, and whose president only remains in power because of the massive electoral fraud during the 2009 presidential election. Indeed, even ex-CIA Director David Petraeus probably identified the key driver recently in an online discussion with NATO's Atlantic Council, when he acknowledged that the US were acutely aware that there was approximately $2 trillion worth of minerals in Afghanistan, including lithium, rare earth, and all the other minerals that are in such demand. Finally, I think it's important to look at another campaign promise that President Biden has ignored, that of putting together the most diverse team in history. In fact, he has appointed a decision-making team of mostly professional class people, the great majority of whom are connected to the US plutocracy through participation in leading think tanks, such as the Council on Foreign Relations. There can be no doubt then that we have the US led once again by an elite that will strive to maintain neoliberalism and US hegemony on the world stage. For those who have never heard of the Council, it is the most important US policy think tank, which has set US grand strategy for over a century and at all times promoting US imperialism. It is unquestionably the most powerful private organization in the world, the internal hub of US monopoly finance capital, providing a networking and agenda-setting forum for the capitalist class. As Lawrence Shoup has revealed in a recent monthly review article, no less than 17 Biden team members are members of or have close family ties to the Council, including Vice President Harris, Secretary of State Blinken, Treasury Secretary Yellen, Climate Envoy John Kerry, CIA Director William J. Burns, and the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, to name but a few. Since the Second World War, the Council has been vital in setting out the imperial strategy for US involvement in every one of its major wars. Alarmingly, in the last few years, the Council has been setting out an aggressive new strategy towards China, with a recurring theme centering on the need for a, quote, a less cooperative, more confrontational US policy to block China, even if it creates, and I quote again, dangerous circumstances. In other words, it is clear that the Council believes it is now worth risking a catastrophic war to maintain US hegemony. If indeed the Council, and by extension President Biden's team, or whoever indeed succeeds him, remains focused on global domination at the expense of building a truly multipolar international community, or indeed the urgency of ecological sustainability, there is precious little hope then of world peace, as we will slide further into the inevitable collapse of human civilization as we know it. Thanks very much.